Okay, so now we're gonna figure out how do I determine the number of sig figs in my final answer when I'm doing a calculation. So the first thing we need to do is what kind of mathematical calculation are we doing? So we're gonna have two different rules for our sig figs in this case. We're gonna have the rules for when we do multiplying and dividing, and then on the next slide we'll talk about addition and subtraction. So if I'm doing multiplying or dividing in my math, then the answer is going to be based on the fewest number of sig figs in the numbers I used. So fewest number of sig figs. So to figure out how many sig figs my final answer should be rounded to, I have to know how many sig figs each one of these have. So that's where the rules that we just did in the previous session come into play. So I have this. You want to go ahead and put the whole thing in your calculator. So this would be my calculator answer. But then I don't know, do I write 45 or 45.012? Like, how many decimal places do I go? So I have to look at the numbers I used to figure out how many decimal places I go to. So we look at our first number and we have to say, well, how many significant figures does this have? So remember, the 5 and the 2 count. They're non-zero. The 0 is an interior, so it counts. So this has 3. So what I like to do is I like to write it underneath. Okay, that has 3 sig figs. Here. Now, you might say, okay, a lot of people sometimes will think this is ambiguous, but remember, these are all non-zero, which means they all count. Okay? So just because there's not a decimal doesn't mean, oh, no decimal, it's ambiguous automatically, so don't go there. Rule number 1, if it's not a 0, it counts. So this means that all 5 of these count. All right, the 1 counts because it's a non-zero. This is a leading 0, and so leading zeros don't count. Trailing 0, but I have a decimal place, so it counts. So 1, 2. So what's the fewest number of sig figs? This was 3, this was 5, this is 2. So you put your whole thing in your calculator, you get your calculator answer, and then you round at the end. So I need to round it to 2 sig figs. So I start at the beginning, this one counts, this one counts. So that's where it's going to stop, and because this is a 0, I round down to get 45. Okay, let's do the next one. So you take it, you do the math, you get your calculator answer. Always get your calculator answer first before you start rounding. Okay, you want to make sure that the number you actually answer is mathematically correct. Sometimes I will be like, what's the final answer to this problem? And instead of telling me 45 or some number like 45 something, some people will tell me 2. Like, mathematically the answer is not 2. So make sure your answer is correct mathematically and then make sure it's correct sig fig wise. All right, so we do this, we get our mathematical answer, then we have to look at sig figs. These are all non-zeros, so they all count, so that's 4. This is non-zero, non-zero, so it counts. This is a trailing 0, but there's a decimal, so it counts, so that's 3. So what's the least number for 3? So it should be 3. Leading zeros don't count, so we just leave that. Then we go 1, 2, 3. So that's where it ends. But because this is a 9, remember, 9s mean that I have to round up, so that's why we get 0.966, okay, as our final answer. So that's how we do it if it's multiplication and division. So now let's look at what are the rules if it's addition and subtraction. Okay, so if I'm doing addition or subtraction, it's the fewest number of decimal places. Okay, so big difference. Our last one was fewest number of sig figs. This one is going to be decimal places. So this one's actually kind of easier because you don't have to know any of the sig fig rules we did. Just have to count decimal places. So we got this, this, and this plus added together. So first thing, do your math. Get your calculator answer. Now let's look at decimal places. How many decimal places here? Not sig figs. Sig figs would be 3, but decimal places is 2. Here, 3 decimal places. And then the last one is also 3 decimal places. The least number that I have is 2, so that means this should be 2 decimal places. So 9.21, because the 4 means I round down. Okay. All right, let's do the next one. How many decimal places? Just 1. Okay. How many decimal places here? 3. So I've already put it all in my calculator, got my calculator answer. My lowest number of decimal places is 1. So the first decimal place here, this is a 3, so I round down, so it's just 0.8. 0.8. Okay? So that's if I'm doing addition and subtraction. So usually people like that one better because it's just decimal places, you don't have to worry about all the sig fig rules, and it's faster. All right, so before we start putting it all together, making it, the last thing we have to do with sig figs is what if we have to do addition and subtraction with multiplication and division? So before we put it all together, let me remind you of one rule. So one rule we need to keep in, one rule we need to keep in mind is when we round. So anytime you're doing a problem on a test or a homework or anything in my class, do not round till the very end. So if you're doing steps in your calculator and you get an answer, you're gonna write that down, leave at least like 4 to 5 decimal places. Don't worry about sig figs, don't worry about any of that till the very end when it's your final circle answer, okay? So as you're going, what I want you to do is write like 4 to 5 decimal places because we're talking about really, really small things, atoms and molecules you can't see. So what that means is you need to make sure your numbers are right on, okay? So if you round too soon, as you go, that little bit of being off at the beginning is going to keep getting more and more, it's gonna get bigger, so by the end, your numbers are really far off, okay? So only round at the end, so don't worry about it until the end with your sig figs and whatnot. So don't round till the end. All right, so let's look about putting our multiplication and our division together. So when doing different kinds of operations, I've got multiplication and subtraction, then we need to follow our typical rules. So this is the PEMDAS. So remember when you took math class, parentheses, multiplication, and then division, and then addition and subtraction, okay? So first is, in our case, we'll do parentheses, and then after parentheses, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. All right, so the first thing you want to do is you want to always do the math. We want to make sure that we do our calculator math first. So we want to do this number minus this number. Okay? When we do that, that number is 3.37. Okay? This is our calculator math. Now we have to multiply that by 3.489. When we do that, when we multiply those, our big calculator answer is 11.75793. So that's the first thing we want to do is just do the math. So now we need to figure out, well, where do I round? How many sig figs does that last number have? So now we need to do our rules. So the first thing we did was subtraction. So let's think about what was our subtraction rule. Our subtraction rule was decimal places. So let's look. This number has how many decimal places? 2. This number has 1. So this had 2 decimal places, this had 1. So what that means is that this answer should only be significant to 1 decimal place. Now, this is where a lot of people get wrong. They'll just round this to 3.4, then multiply, and keep going. That's what the slide before said not to do. Do not round this. Use the whole number in your math, okay? What we do, since it's only significant to 1 decimal place, is I put a little underline. So that tells me that when I'm counting significant figures, I only count up to that number. But if I'm doing math, I have to use the whole thing, okay? So now let's look at the next part. So now it's this times this. So what was our multiplication rule? The least number of significant figures. So now I have to look at those. 3.489, it's all non-zero numbers, so that means they all count, so that's 4 sig figs. Okay? This is 3.37, but we said it only goes up to the first decimal place. So when you count sig figs, you say 1, 2 sig figs, not 3. We write the whole thing out for math. When we're counting sig figs, we stop when we get to our line. So 2 sig figs. So then my answer should be in the least number of significant figures, which is 2. So that counts, so it stops right here. This is a 7, so that means I round out. So my final answer is going to be 12. Because that counts, and because that's a 7, I round up. Okay? So we're going to stop the video here, and before you start the next video, I want you to try these problems. So it's got multiplication and division by itself, addition and subtraction by itself, and then we put it all together. So a good way to practice all your significant figure rules. And if you can do the bottom 2, that's as hard as it gets. Okay? So try those, and then once you get them done, you can start the next video.